In today's podcast, we're digging into Dublin with the best highlights for families. Hey everyone, thank you so much for joining me again here on the Traveling in Ireland podcast. Today I am really excited because we are going to be diving into Dublin. And not just Dublin, but Dublin with kids. But before we get started, I just want to remind you, if you visit a place that you heard about on the podcast, be sure to let them know. This helps me to get more great guests on the show and share terrific attractions and tips. So go ahead and be a name dropper. Just say, I heard about you on the Traveling in Ireland podcast. So Dublin, it's a great city, and it's a popular city for most visitors to Ireland because it's usually the first or the last destination that people visit because the majority of travelers come into Dublin Airport. But for families visiting with young children or even teens, Dublin can be a little bit overwhelming because some of the more popular attractions like the Guinness Storehouse or St. Patrick's Cathedral or even the Book of Kells may not appear to be family friendly at first glance. So today I am joined by Garvin Rush. Now, Garvin is the founder of Dublin Tour Guide, and he's going to be sharing his insights into the most family-friendly attractions in Dublin for kids from toddler to teen. So Garvin, thank you so much for joining me today. I'm really excited to jump into this topic with you.
Thanks, Jody. It's great to be here.
So I'm going to make an admission that I did not love Dublin when I first traveled there with my kids when they were little. Now, Brenna was, she was 1, I think, the first time we visited Dublin, and she's 19 now. So it's been a while, but as they've gotten older, new attractions have opened and older attractions have updated. I found that Dublin is much more young tourist friendly. So what would you say makes Dublin a welcoming location for families to visit?
So there's several reasons. Unlike a lot of places like, let's say, London, where you need to use public transport to get around, in Dublin, the city centre is quite small. The distance from one side of the city to the other is maybe less than 20 minutes it would take you, typically. And most of the attractions, besides the aforementioned Guinness Storehouse, are within that city centre core. So it's a very walkable city. It is a very flat city. So if you were pushing a stroller or had to drag kids around, you're not dragging them up and down hills. So it's very flat. There's like maybe a 10-foot high incline at Dublin Castle, and that's about it. Likewise, most of the transitions are fine. Obviously, if you're talking about the Temple Bar area, it's all cobblestones there, which can be a bit tricky to walk on. And it's nice and easy to get lost in, which can be a good thing or a bad thing, depending on if anybody's hungry at the time. So it just logistically, it's very easy to get around. If you stay in the city center, you can reach practically all the attractions that I'm going to mention within 15 minutes, depending on where your hotel is located. So that's the first thing to keep in mind, that it's feasible to do Dublin on foot. You don't need to rent a car when you arrive in Dublin, and let's say you're planning to spend a few nights in Dublin. I propose maybe 3, let's say. Don't rent your car right away at the airport. Perhaps just get a taxi, get into the city center and take it easy, get used to vehicles driving on the other side of the road. Get used to that before you jump behind the wheel. Mm-hmm. Takes the stress out of whoever is going to be driving, right? So these are some, useful tips that you wouldn't think of at the time, but that's why we have podcasts like this, right? So that you can learn about this stuff before you, perhaps make mistakes or just, do something that's going to cause you extra stress that you could avoid. So why not avoid that extra stress? Your holiday is supposed to be fun and relaxing, And then another thing is, just as you said, there have been more attractions that have opened that are more family friendly. There's one called Epic Ireland. Now, it's recently been given the title of museum, but it's not a dusty, old, boring museum that most people might think of when they hear the word museum. So it's the story of Irish emigration, and it only opened maybe about 10 years ago. And it is an attraction that's very easy to do. It's great for kids because there's a lot of high tech in it, right? There's a lot of
Hmm.
screens with actors telling their stories. So kids don't have to read much, for example, if that's an issue. Now, it is a big attraction. It would take you could easily spend 2 hours in there, which is obviously too long for well, most people. Of course, most people are not like me. I tend to read and absorb everything because I'm like, I
Hmm.
need to recommend this to people, so I need to understand how good it
I
is.
was there 4 hours and they had to kick me out because they were closing, but it's phenomenal. I love Epic.
Yeah, yeah, it's brilliant. It's brilliant. And even if there's kids that don't really want to stand and learn or watch or engage with it, there is a fun thing where at the end of each room or each hall, there is a little, what would you call it? A little,
Passport stamp thing, yeah?
yeah, stamp your passport. So they give you this passport at the start, and then you just make sure you stamp it in every room. And that's just a fun thing for the kids to do.
It's a great souvenir. I think that's just a fabulous little souvenir to take home too. And I love that you mentioned how interactive this museum is because you in one room you're going to follow the steps and learn an Irish dance step, and then in another one, the library I love because you pull out the books and they talk to you. It's just so good.
Yeah, yeah, it's brilliant. And it's quite diverse in that respect. So there's enough interaction in it. So
Hmm.
I like to kind of rate attractions by their difficulty level. That's not the only metric I look at, but it helps when you're trying to plan your day. So
Hmm. Hmm.
you start the day with the most difficult stuff, and then you should make it easier as you go along,
Very
right?
smart.
Um, so that means something like if we were just talking about adults, you would not do Guinness or Jameson or a distillery first. You would do
Hmm.
that at the end as your treat, as your reward for doing the other stuff. So, Guinness might be a 1 out of 5 in terms of difficulty. Epic might be a 3 out of 5. The National Museum might be a 5 out of 5. National Museum, it is probably the best attraction in Dublin. I'm not going to lie, I am probably biased because anybody who loves history will put that as number one
So
because they're
are you saying the National Museum of Archaeology? Is that the one you're talking about?
that's
Obvious. That's one of my favorites too.
yeah, and that's a good distinction because there's another one called Decorative Arts and History. That's in the area as well. And they have different exhibitions on at different times. That's an interesting one, but I'd say the main one is the archaeology one. And that's 5 out of 5, unless you're doing a tour with us. We have a museums tour, which makes the National Museum, the National Gallery, and the National Library far more accessible because we only stay in there for maybe 30 to 45 minutes. We only look at the highlights, so the pieces that are important for Irish people, and then we get out. And by get out, I mean the guide pulls themselves out of the institution, especially at the museum, because there's so many things to talk about that you really want to stay in there for 2 hours and chat about
Hmm.
them. But you must not. You must not. So the guide has to restrain themselves for sure to get out of there. But if you do go there by yourself without a guide and you're coming with kids, they do have a kind of like a treasure hunt. They do have these great things that you could fill in as a kid to go and find different things and find out little things. So that makes it a bit more interesting than just wandering around looking and reading things.
It really does. I did that with my girls when they were not quite tweens. I want to say maybe 7 and 9, 8 and 10. And gosh, the interest they had in what they were looking for and seeing, it made a huge difference. So if your kids aren't museum, just not going to deal with a museum, it really does make it a fun, almost a game, I guess.
Yes. Yeah. And even if you don't do that, there are parts in the museum where you can, for example, you take a piece of paper and you put it over this relief in bronze and you use a pencil and you just trace over it and you get to trace out the figure or the image of a replica of, let's say, a Bronze Age shield from the museum. So that's pretty cool. I think everyone loves to do that. I've done that a few times, actually. So, there are these facilities that are available for kids of all ages.
And I think that's been a big change that has probably only come about in, again, the last 10 to 12 years. There have been a lot of upgrades. I don't know if that's the right word, but just a lot more thought into families than there used to be in Dublin. And I loved what you said about the fact that the city is small and easy to get around. And we even found that, the Lewis or the light rail to Phoenix Park, super easy to use even with a stroller. And obviously that's where Dublin Zoo is, which I would say is probably one of the better attractions if your kids are under 5, right?
Yeah. And Dublin Zoo is the second oldest zoo in the world. It might be third. So don't hold me to that. But I do know it has the famous MGM lion. That is an Irish lion, technically. That lion was from Dublin Zoo. So for everyone who doesn't know what I'm talking about, at the start of the old movies where you see a lion inside a great brand and it roars, this is a lion from Dublin Zoo that was able to roar on command, which obviously is very useful if you're trying to get it to roar, right? You needed to be trained. So that famous lion is an Irish lion, ironically. But Dublin Zoo is fantastic. It's not just old, but it is quite vibrant and it's a wonderful zoo. And as well as, you can find some wildlife outside the zoo, inside Phoenix Park. It's a huge park. It is, as you said, it's close enough to the city centre. You just use the Lewis, spelled Luas, Lewis. Lewis is it's the Irish word for speed that, everyone finds ironic because it's like the slowest tram service in Europe. No stops for everything. So we call it the Lewis or the Daniel Day. The Daniel Day Lewis. So you put that out to roundabout Phoenix Park, a little bit of a walk to get there. And then when you do get to Phoenix Park, it is a bit of a walk to see the park because you could fit Central Park into it nearly twice. So it's a huge park and it has a herd of wild deer. They're rather tame now. You could technically feed them carrots. Don't feed them anything. It's generally the rule. Leave them alone. They got plenty of grass to eat. But it is cool to be able to walk up to them and, take a selfie. They tend to be pretty tame and safe outside of, mating season, obviously. But they're small enough. They're quite tame. Or even just, rent some bikes. You arrive at Phoenix Park, you just just come in the main gates, and just to the left, you can't miss it, there's a bike rental place. And that's fantastic. Go there, rent bikes, cycle all through the park. It's a breath of fresh air, and it's amazing that you have this huge space that is, just a hop, skip, and a jump away from the dead center of Dublin City. Just talking about other attractions that Dublin has developed over the last 20 years or so, there is, one of my favorites. It's called the National Leprechaun Museum. Have you been to this one?
I have not. I will admit I have not been to the Leprechaun Museum.
So obviously it's called the Leprechaun Museum for international tourists because internationally people know what a leprechaun is, whereas in Ireland we would use the word fairy. So the National Fairy Museum about different types of fairies, of which the leprechaun is only one. But obviously you need to sell, right? You need to get people in and know what you're talking about. In the National Leprechaun Museum, the guide brings you through the attraction, through different rooms. There's a room you go into and all the furniture is huge. So the furniture is like 3 times the size or the scale that it is normally, which means that you are perceiving it the way a leprechaun would perceive your living room. So you have to actually climb to get up onto the armchair, right? And that's great. So, and then you walk through a rainbow, and there's all this stuff. And then at the end, the guide will tell you one of the many stories that they have in their repertoire about the fairies. So I love going there because every time you go, there's a different story. My background is in medieval Irish and Celtic studies. It's what I studied at university. And I love to say when I was at university that I have a great course. I go in and the teacher, the professor tells us a story. which is an amazing thing to say. Now, there was some work involved as well, but for the most part, it was Irish mythology, Irish history, the Vikings, St. Patrick, the Celts before they came to Ireland, women in Irish society, early Irish law, a lot of very interesting stuff. I like to summarize it as Ireland before the 12th century. So, a fascinating course, fascinating degree, and not a very employable one. And I was just lucky that I tripped and landed into tour guiding because it has served me very well. I'm just delighted that I followed my passion instead of doing something more employable. But of course, that's only possible because of the fantastic facility we have here in Ireland, which is free third level education. That made it possible. Otherwise, my parents would have said, yeah, Celtic studies, philosophy, Garvin, why don't you take up business, Mike?
Makes it a little easier to do something with that degree for sure.
Yes. But I mean, I had the business afterwards. And I've been tour guiding since 2009. So it's coming up on the 15th year anniversary. And I set up a Dublin tour guide in 2013. And we have a growing team of soon to be 9 guides that are, well, they're trained for their ability to tailor tours for the particular participants. So in other words, you don't do the same tour when you have a couple in their 60s as you do when you have a family.
Right. And I want to dig into that more, but first let's back up a little bit and go back. So we've said, kind of why Dublin is a great area for families. And you mentioned, spending about 3 days in Dublin a few minutes ago. And the average Ireland vacation being 8 days. So people will, they'll have a travel day. They'll have about 8 days in Ireland, and then they'll have another travel day, making a 10-day vacation in total. Would you say that you would spend 3 days in Dublin, or would you shorten that just knowing that, there's so much more of Ireland left to see? What would you say is the perfect amount of time for a family to spend in Dublin?
Oh, well, it's more to do with the ratio, I suppose. There's a minimum and then there's the ratio. So the minimum is that you need 2 full days in Dublin, right? That's your minimum. And then that should be kind of, if you're doing 2 days in Dublin, then you've got maybe 5, 6 days, 7 days outside of Dublin. And obviously, if you're throwing on another week, then you're at least having another day in Dublin, preferably 2, because Dublin can be your base for exploring the vicinity as well. So Dublin, you got County Wicklow. That's a great place for people if they're interested in scenery. It's just, a great snapshot of the scenery that Ireland's famous for. So you go through, verdant valleys. You can see some proper wild deer and ancient monasteries and all the rest, and do nice, like, gentle walks, but also you can do some hikes and some cycles around the place. So that's easy to get to from Dublin. Or, you could just take the train, just called the Dart, take the Dart south or north, and you could go to seaside towns like Dunleary in the south, which if you try to look it up, just use Google Maps and zoom in, but because it's spelled Dún Laogahe. So just remember the DUN part. Or you could go north to Howth. We have a tour that is a coastal walk of Howth. And that's wonderfully refreshing and interesting as well, because it's not just a seaside town. Everywhere in Ireland has mythology, stories, and history associated with it, So there's plenty of things to do in Dublin. But yeah, the question is, what's the ratio? Now, ideally, you should spend kind of 2 weeks in Ireland, but, we don't live in an ideal world. That's what you would aim for if you could. Or, as you said, 8 days sounds great. I mean, 8 days is the average, as you said. So a lot of people do spend 2 weeks. But Dublin is one part. It's one leg of the journey. Seeing the west of Ireland, seeing the countryside, that is the real Ireland. You couldn't say that New York is America.
Right.
You need to get out there to the countryside. You know, so I hope that kind of answers your question. So as a minimum,
2 days minimum. That's what I got. 2 days minimum.
yeah.
Excellent. So before we talk more about your business, which I'm really, really interested to dig into that, I want to talk about food because, obviously there's always the thought that, Irish food is rather bland, which I have been beating the drum on how good Irish food is for quite a while. But there are restaurants that are going to definitely be more family friendly than others. Obviously sitting down for a 5-course meal with young children is not ideal. So a few places that I really love, I like Casey Peaches because you can get really good food for not a lot of money there. The pasty shop in Temple Bar, if you just want to grab something and walk, I really love that. I'll have to look up the name of it to put into the show notes, but I really love their pasties. And then I never skip Murphy's Ice Cream ever. And Gallagher's Boxty House in Temple Bar is another place that I really love because I love their Boxty sampler. And then W. Plunkett, because they do like a dinner and show on Mondays and Thursdays. And their dinner and show is less known and not so crowded, I guess, as some of like Celtic Nights and things like that. So I really, really like those options for family meals. What would you add to that?
Well, you mentioned some great places there. I just add a proviso that the KC Peaches wouldn't be available for dinner unless you have an early enough dinner. In other words, they close at about 6 o'clock most of the time, most of the year.
Mm-hmm. Good point.
I agree with everything you said there. The pasty shop is in Merchant's Arch. So this is a quaint little lane that brings you from Temple Bar Square through an arch to the Halfpenny Bridge, so to the River Liffey. Murphy's Ice Cream, I always recommend, if you do go there, get samples and do them in this order.
Yes.
Irish sea salt, so sea salt. Number 2, caramelized brown bread.
My favorite.
If they have it, they might swap out things seasonally. And then my favorite is the gin ice cream. So obviously that does have alcohol in it, so that's only for the adults. But
and it's strong alcohol too. That is a strong one. Their stout, their chocolate stout, is also relatively strong.
Yeah, they have. What do they have at the moment? No, they don't have that at the moment. They've gone to, I think, chocolate whiskey is the one that as an alternative to that. And they've also got sorbets as well, which are very refreshing. And then Gallagher's Boxty House, as you mentioned, that even though that is in Temple Bar, it is pretty damn good in terms of the quality, consistency, and the service. So yeah, I am a fan of Gallagher's Boxty House. Probably talked about that. And again, as you said, the dinners and shows, there are a few places. There is one in Howth that we sometimes go to after we finish the Howth tour, and it's in the Abbey Tavern. So it's great to be able to go to these smaller shows that are they're more engaging. It's not like you're 100 feet away from the performers. Like, as you said, it sometimes feels like that with some of these more popular, better advertised attractions, right?
Right.
And then I'm going to throw out 2 kind of very different categories. One is cafes. So there are 2 great cafes that are very, toddler friendly. So they not just have the high chairs, they don't just have the high chairs, they have, coloring books, things for the kids to do. So that would be Social Fabric Cafe, which is in Stony Batter, Manor Street, so Manor, Social Fabric Cafe. I was there recently. We used to live in the area, and they do fantastic food, and it's very easy to get a stroller in there. And you can kind of tell by the name of the cafe, right? Social Fabric Cafe, right? So there's that. There's Flour and Bean, which is even better. Flour and Bean on Cork Street. Again, both of these not that close to the city centre, but if you are in that area, they're fantastic places for strollers and for toddlers. And then, if you wanted to, not just have dinner, but make it interesting. In the Stag's Head, they host irishfolkloretours.com. So
Okay.
they have an evening of stories. And
Mhm.
it is obviously, it's not part of dinner. So you have it. They used to do a combination where it was dinner included. I'm glad they discontinued that, because when I did it 10 years ago or so, it wasn't the best dinner, you know?
Mhm.
So they've
Mhm.
separated that out, which is great, because now they can just focus on delivering quality stories. And that seems to be recommended for kids from 6 upwards, according to the website, irishfolktours.com. And then you could just explore any of the restaurants nearby. Now, in the area, there are plenty of restaurants. If you are worried about, the size of your party, or you haven't booked anything in advance, then my go-to is always Brasserie 66. So Brasserie 66 is central enough, and they have a huge capacity. So they can always take you. If you have 6
Nice.
people, 8 people, it's always a great backup to go there if you just need to get into a restaurant, basically. So that's one that I'd recommend. If you're with the kids and the kids are seeing McDonald's, and you're saying no McDonald's, you can get that at home, or you do feel like you want to reward them, you could bring them to the kind of Irish equivalent of McDonald's, which is called Super Max. So Super Max, spelled Macs at the end, right? One word, Supermax. It's an Irish version of McDonald's. You could call it that. So
They
check
have
that out.
terrific garlic fries.
Oh, you went there, did you?
Oh yeah, I love
Okay, great,
Supermax.
great. So it's got a few ones, but it's on O'Connell Street, so it's very central, easy to go to. So you might check that out
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
if you wanted to, experience something a bit local. Obviously, not the healthiest food. It's not like what you were talking about with Casey Peaches.
Right.
There's a few places, like that in Dublin as well. Most of them not the most accessible, I would say. There's a great vegetarian restaurant if you're coming with teenagers, if they are vegetarian, and it's called Glass, Glas. Glass, fantastic, new-ish vegetarian restaurant. But yeah, you want to make sure that the kids will eat the food, because you need a little bit of a budget for it. Let's just say. Then, if you wanted to completely ruin their diet, you could bring them to Butler's Chocolate Factory. So Butler is an Irish chain of cafes that specialize in chocolate this, that, and the other. You could find them in Dublin, and you definitely should. They have several different hot chocolates. I don't bother with caramel this and hazelnut that. I just go with the dark hot chocolate, because if you try it, it might be the best hot chocolate you've ever tasted. That is the case for me anyway. I love their dark hot chocolate. It is rich, it is decadent. You probably need to share it, even though it's a small cup that it comes in. You might feel like you need to share it. So check that out. Whatever drink you buy, you do get a complimentary chocolate, and they have, their nice kind of artisanal looking chocolates there.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Or, as I said, you could check out the factory. You do both. The factory is not far from the airport. So, just for everyone's orientation, the airport is about 35 minutes north of the city centre. And so, Butler's Chocolate Factory might be about 10 minutes south of the airport. So, in between the airport and the city. So, you could do that on the way in or the way out. And you obviously get to go through the factory, not go through it. They obviously have a walkway with windows. When I was there, I got to paint my own chocolate bear. They show you how the Easter eggs were made. There's plenty of chocolate to eat, so you get a great hit of that theobromine and the sugar. So that's a nice little
Very
treat.
nice.
I think that's particularly good for kids. It's just be very exciting for them. So I don't know if you want
Definitely.
to count that as a meal.
Ending on a high point there. I like the suggestion for butlers, because that option to do one of their factory tours with the hands-on is always fun. But I mean, even if you're just walking around Dublin and you stop at one of the cafes, yeah, it's always a good visit when there's chocolate involved.
Yeah, absolutely. And I just want to cover a few more things for toddlers. Let's go with toddlers, and then I'll do kids, and then I'll do teens. So,
Okay.
attractions for toddlers, obviously kind of looking at playgrounds, and there's great playgrounds in Stephen's Green, which is the most popular park in Dublin. You were probably in Stephen's Green, right? And then Merrion Square, which is nearly adjacent. It's a block away from Stephen's Green.
Mm-hmm.
And it has what's called the Giant's Garden. And it's a great name because it references the fact that that square used to be a private park. So it was only available and
Mm-hmm.
accessible to the people that lived in the square. And one of those people was Oscar Wilde. So when he was a kid, he was able to get in there and enjoy the park, whereas kids from outside of that neighborhood, they couldn't come in. Rare green space in the city center
Mm-hmm.
seemed a bit selfish. Years later, Oscar Wilde writes a children's story. So, yeah, if you do have kids of the storybook age, get them some Oscar Wilde stories. In fact, all ages, because some of the stories are more suitable for older kids.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the stories is called Selfish Giant. And in it, the giant finds out that these kids are breaking into his garden and playing, and he kicks them out, seals up the hole gouged out of his bush, and keeps them out. And days go by, weeks go by, months go by, it starts snowing. It doesn't stop snowing. And the garden is trapped in eternal winter until the giant realizes that it was because he was being so selfish. So
Mm-hmm.
he opened a hole in the perimeter fence, let the kids in, and spring came. And, spring came, summer came, the kids were happy, he was
Mm-hmm.
happy that people were enjoying his garden and his garden was vibrant. So you could see how that ties in quite nicely with the playground in Merrion Square, which is now public, of course. So that's kind of for the toddlers. For the kids, we already mentioned Epic. We mentioned the National Leprechaun Museum. National Museum has a bit of a treasure hunt there. If you do go to the Book of Kells, make sure to get a coloring book,
Mm-hmm.
advanced level coloring book stuff. If you've ever seen the Book of Kells, the most intricate Celtic interlace design you'd ever see. So incredible. And I love getting a coloring book from the Book of Kells shop after I finish there. And then there's also Dublinia. You know about Dublinia?
Mm-hmm.
So Dublinia is great because it's really for kids. So it's designed for kids. What would I say? Aged kind of 5 to 13.
That's what I would say. Yeah.
Oh, great. Because I don't have any kids. I got one coming soon, any day now. And my wife is at full term. So, yeah, it's all ahead of me. But Dublinia is a museum and an attraction that is focused on Dublin's medieval and Viking period. So
Mm-hmm.
it's cool. You see, Vikings, look at swords and shields, and it's very interactive and it's very fun. To be honest, I think that would be my favorite place as a kid, not just me personally, but as a recommendation because it is so interactive and
Mm-hmm.
there's no screens. I don't recall seeing screens.
There are no screens there. And, it has kind of that creepy fascination quality to it, too. I think just because it is a little bit of an older museum. So it has that little bit of spookiness to it as well that children love.
Yeah, I agree with that. Absolutely. And then the last thing is we have a tour called Songs and Stories. This is a tour that obviously delves into some of the lesser known songs and stories associated with Dublin and Ireland. And we go through the city, we look at those sculptures or monuments. You hear the background story, and then myself or one of my other guides who can sing will sing a song related to that. So that is quite interesting for particular families if they know it. Particularly if there's girls, right, that want to
Mm-hmm.
have something that's more than just somebody talking boringly about facts, which is
Mm-hmm.
we don't
Mm-hmm.
like to do that anyway. We don't say that we do it in a boring way, but that's the Songs and Stories tour. Then we're moving on to attractions for teens. I don't know what would my favorite one be, but in Ireland, as you know, we have Gaelic games. So we have Irish games like Gaelic football and hurling. And these are wonderfully obscure and unusual sports, particularly hurling. You could call it a cross
Mm-hmm.
between lacrosse and Quidditch from Harry Potter because it is so unusual and fast. And we have the National Stadium in Dublin. So it's not the stadium for the city of Dublin, it's not for the club of Dublin, it's for the whole country. It's the biggest amateur stadium in the world. So the sport is amateur, they don't get paid.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's over 82,500 people could fit into Crow Park. So it's spelled Croke. And obviously, it'd be wonderful to go there at this time of year. So, kind of from about, let's say, March until August is when the championship is on. And that's when you'd see the most atmosphere there.
Mm-hmm.
And it'd be great to go. The tickets are very affordable. And that's by design. So they kind of have rules in place. So it's not like going to Madison Square Gardens in New York.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
It is something like €30 a ticket, €50 a ticket, depending on how serious the game is, semi-final, final, etc. And that's just like a wonderful Irish experience because Gaelic games are more vibrant today than they've ever been.
Mm-hmm.
But if you do go to it when there's not a game on, they do have a museum and a tour where you can learn about the game, and it's relatively interactive. At the end, they finish off at kind of like, well, the equivalent of a playground where you get to have a go yourself. You get to try to kick the ball, you get to try to jump very high to catch the balls. So they do have that. But if you feel like your kids are less about doing a tour, more about the sporting aspect of it, there is a great tour attraction in the south of Dublin called Experience Gaelic Games. I don't know if you know about that,
Mm-hmm.
Jody. Yeah. So this is far more hands-on. Yeah, it's a great day out. Experience Gaelic Games.
And you get to experience 2 or 3, I believe, as opposed to maybe if you're in Kilkenny, you do a hurling experience. You're only doing hurling, whereas the Experience Gaelic Games, I believe, has Gaelic football and hurling.
Yes.
I want to say there's something else, but I'm not positive.
Probably you're thinking of Irish handball, which we have. In Europe, they have handball. It's a different type of handball. It's a team game, whereas what we have here is it's like squash, except without a racket, you're using your hands. So it's a sore game, let's say. But that's Experience Gaelic Games. That's well recommended.
Yeah, excellent tip.
And I guess, one that perhaps you would use everywhere, but if I were like a 16, 17, 18-year-old kid, I'd love to go to an escape room. So you could check out those. There's a few of them around. There's also a place called Token, so Token, as in a token for an arcade game. And it is just a load of arcade games. And that can just be kind of a break if you want to do something different. They have some good, inventive diner food there as well. So it's not a bad place to eat. And they serve beer if something. But it's a fun place and it's great. It's great nostalgia, I think, for the parents, but it could also be fun for the kids as well. And then I think maybe just the last thing I'd mention is the National Gallery, which, can be difficult, just like the museum, doing it by yourself. And we obviously have a tour, it's a museums tour that brings people into the National Gallery and just shows you the highlights of the institution. That's about it. I don't think I mentioned everything that was by design, but hopefully there's something there that's going to be useful or intriguing for you.
Really, this has been so much information. So I want to now go back because you talked a little bit about how you started Dublin Tour Guide, that it came from, basically your interest in the history and the mythology of Ireland. And you've mentioned a few of your tours. So do you want to talk a little bit more about Dublin Tour Guide and how people can book with you and a little bit about that?
Yeah, no problem. So we specialize in private walking tours. That's a big thing. So we're all about customizing the tour because, you come with your family. You don't want to have the guide say the same thing that he says every single day. You want it to be different. You want to be specialized. And, your family have, particular needs. And not every kid could do a 3-hour tour. And indeed, we have a 3 hour tour. All the tours are kind of minimum 3 hours, but we have a break halfway through. So it is paced appropriately. And, as I said, we have different types of tours as well, depending on your interests. So, best idea, go to the website, dublintourguide.ie. You can see the different tours there, the sightseeing tours, the themed tours, for example, Songs and Stories tour, museums tour. There's also the tour to Hoth. And then, you can read up about them and see, what's included. But easiest thing is just to send us an email, tell us what your situation is, and we'd suggest a tour that could be helpful or
Very
suitable
good.
for you. That's the best idea. And then you could book directly on the website.
Perfect. And any social accounts that people can follow to kind of see what you do, look at the guides, kind of that kind of thing?
Yeah, sure. So every time we do a tour, we post a group selfie up on Facebook. So you can find us on Facebook. It's just Dublin Tour Guide. Same thing with Instagram, though Instagram would be more quirky, different Dublin, more interesting random things in there.
Oh, fun.
Those would be the main ones. We don't really use Twitter/X that much anymore. And then, of course, the website, we do have some articles on the website as well. We're currently getting the website redeveloped, so there should be some more articles coming up by the time this gets published, which would hopefully be beneficial to the listeners.
Perfect, Garvin. Well, thank you so much. There is so much information in this. As my listeners know, everything that we talk about will be linked within the article. But I want to finish with those top 3 recommendations that I know we've talked about them. You went through them, but just to kind of wrap it up, your number 1 spot with little children, your number 1 spot with teens, and your number 1 spot that everybody in the family will enjoy.
So I don't know how little we're going, but I would say the Leprechaun Museum.
Okay.
Leprechaun Museum, that hits a lot of bases. If they're slightly older, I'd go with either Dublinia or Epic. Right, it's a tough one. It's a tough one. And then the older ones, again, if they're sporty, I would say either Crow Park or Experience Gaelic Games. If they're not so sporty, then maybe Token or maybe the Chocolate Factory.
I think the Chocolate Factory probably falls under the one everyone will love.
Yeah, absolutely.
Oh, excellent. Well, this has been so informative, so much terrific information, and I just want to thank you so much for taking the time to chat with me today.
Absolutely, Jody, and I hope you're excited about coming back. When was the last time you were here?
March.
Oh, great. Yeah. You're staying fresh. Absolutely.
Yeah. I tend to visit often, which is always a great time. You always look forward to the next time.
Excellent. Yeah, March is a great time with St. Patrick's Day. April is probably my favorite month to visit because it's technically the driest month of the year in Ireland, and that includes the summer months, believe it or not. So if your family does happen to get away outside of summer, April would be a great month.
Excellent. Good advice. I like September, but it's gotten a lot busier than it used to be. So April is definitely worth checking out.
Absolutely. Well, thanks very much for having me, Jody. It was a pleasure to be here, and I hope I didn't take up too much of your time.
No, it's perfect. Like I said, there's so much information for Dublin, so definitely a lot for people to check out here.
Well, thanks very much.
There was so much information in that podcast, so I just want to give you a quick reminder that you can visit the full show notes at Ireland Family Vacations. Just open that podcast episode on your app, scroll down to the bottom, and you will find a direct link. Also, my 7 Castles in 7 Days itinerary includes Dublin and then takes you through the southwest up to the Cliffs of Moher, and then you can either fly out of Shannon or head back to Dublin for your flight. It's a perfect family itinerary, and you can find that at irelandfamilyvacations.com/castles. CASTLES. As always, if you enjoyed this podcast, I would really appreciate if you would leave a 5-star review at Apple Podcasts or Spotify. If you cannot leave a review on your podcast app, you can leave a review on the Ireland Family Vacations Facebook page, Or you can snap a screenshot of the podcast, pop it into your Instagram stories, and just say something nice. I'll see it and share it on my site as well. Thank you again so much for listening. If you have any comments or questions, you can always email me, Jody, Jody, at IrelandFamilyVacations.com. Until next time, slán go fóill.